Bob is making. So here we go.
We
Good
just ask
evening,
everyone to mute as well. Sorry.
indeed. And we do expect more people to join us. So I'm going to say good evening, everyone. I'm Martine Jago. I work at Pepperdine University in the Graduate School of Education and Psychology. And I'm delighted to be a partner at Peach. And we're delighted we welcome you to join this experience with us. So this is the 6th workshop, Culturally Responsive Observation and Assessment. We are funded by the Dr. Seuss Foundation, and we have a couple of introductory slides and statements. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement. We have felt this was appropriate. You will hear from Dr. Sandy K1Haptua Dixon, who is a member of the Hopi Nation. Please listen to their words. Thank you, Bob.
Escalate, new Sandy Konaptewa Dixon, new Hopi to, new Mokopi, new Dawawa, new So'o. My name is Dr. Sandy Kiwanaptewa Dixon. I am Hopi. I am from the village of Mokopi, and I am San Clan. I'm also faculty at Cal Poly Pomona. And also part of that is we always say we're So'o, which is I am a grandmother. I'd like to go ahead and share the land acknowledgement that we use here at Cal Poly Pomona. We recognize that we gather on the territory and ancestral lands of Native California Indians. Cal Poly Pomona acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and South Channel Islands. We also acknowledge that this land remains the shared space among the Kizh, Serrano, Cahuilla, Rumsen Ilonli, and the Seño people. We acknowledge the spiritual connection and rights as the original stewards and traditional caretakers of this land. We thank them for their strength, perseverance, and resistance. We recognize that every member of this community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land ever since it was taken by the settlers to form the city we now live and work in. Consistent with our values of reparations, community, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible our relationship as settlers in relationship to California Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold ourselves and the organizations we work on behalf of more attuned to the needs of American Indian, Native American peoples where we live, work, and organize. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're very grateful for those words. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Peach and the Dr. Seuss Foundation. We're glad you're here with us tonight. Please put your name, affiliation, and role in the chat. We'd love to know who's joining us this evening. We hope that you'll be able to participate as we go through our evening together. Just as an FYI, I'm in Miami, Florida tonight, so it's a little later, but I'm going to stay awake because I'm very excited to be joining you for this session. We have had 5 workshops prior to this evening. Cultural construction of languages, language acquisition and development were both more theoretical, context-based, historical research areas. And then this year we moved into culturally responsive practices to support language development and literacy, facilitating language and literacy in linguistically diverse communities, and last time, reflection and exploration of responsive curriculum. Don't worry if you have not attended those. Tonight can be certainly a standalone as we look at assessment and observation. Over the last few months, we've had an opportunity to learn together. As you see on the screen, these 2-hour workshops are on dual language development and multi-language learners 0 to 8 years of age. So our next slide, please. I'll tell you a little about Peach. This you can certainly read, of course, on the screen, but we are a cross-sector, cross-segmental higher education systems initiative. I'll give you a minute just to look at our mission on the screen. So why this collaboration with Peach and Dr. Seuss? Let's go to our next slide, please. I'll give you a moment to read this quotation that came just 2 years ago from the Guardian newspaper in London. So at this very important time in our history and in terms of us here as educators and trainers of trainers, we would like to share a statement that we share at Peach. Dr. Seuss books, such as Green Eggs and Ham and The Cat in the Hat, resonate for children and adults more than 30 years after the author's death in 1991. Theodor Seuss Geisel was born and raised in Springfield, Massachusetts. His books have been translated into many languages, including Braille, and are sold in over 100 countries. Dr. Seuss Enterprises have decided that 6 Dr. Seuss books are no longer to be published due to racist images and culturally insensitive content. Further, Dr. Seuss Enterprises has reported that an inclusive group of new authors and artists representing a diverse cross-section of the population will create a new series of children's books that include original stories inspired by original Dr. Seuss sketches from archives here at the University of California, San Diego. In this way, Geisel's legacy of motivating young readers, writers, and artists can continue with illustrated tales firmly focused in anti-bias and anti-racism going forward. Thank you. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce, I do with pride and great joy, LaShawn and Jolene, who are going to facilitate learning this evening and guide us through our activities. Please take the microphone, and I'll look forward to seeing everyone at the end. I'd like everyone to mute and stay muted so that we maintain bandwidth. Thank you so much, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. So I am LaShawn Brinson, and you will meet my colleague Jolene in just a few minutes. But I want to get us started. Tonight's focus is on culturally responsive observation and assessment. And so before we get started, just want us to set some intentions when we think about the topic for the workshop tonight. What are some things that we want to make sure we take away, or what do we want to receive from tonight? We want to set an intention to just have an open mind. So just take a second to set an intention. And I like to breathe at the same time. So if you don't mind, also just taking a deep breath and think about what it is you want to take away from tonight. Okay. And if you are just joining us, go ahead and put your name in the chat and where you're from. Okay, so we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So reflecting on our intentions. So as we think about what we want to take away from tonight, I also want you to think about this question. Is readiness the main goal of assessment? So I want you to think about that question as we go through the information for tonight. It might be, your answer might be modified, it might be enhanced, it might be changed altogether, but think about that. Is readiness the main goal of assessment? Next slide. So we're going to start talking about just observing, documenting, and assessing. We're familiar with these terms, of course, as early childhood educators. I'm looking at the chat and seeing what our different roles are as coaches and faculty members. So this is not new to us. So whether you're novice or a teacher, even, this is something that comes natural to us as we're getting to know children, as we are teaching about children and getting to know children and becoming familiar with their families. And NAEYC has made a statement on developmentally appropriate practices for observing, documenting, and assessing young children. So this is just a recap of that to help us stay connected with our topic for tonight. So I italicized some words that I think helps automatically keep us connected with being culturally responsive. So when you look at the statement, it's saying ongoing, strategic, reflective, and purposeful. So we'll be talking a lot about just being reflective as a part of this process. Focus on children's progress towards developmental educational goals, including family input and children's experiences. So again, highlighting how we're staying connected, staying responsive, culturally responsive more specifically. Systematic approach to using observation, documentation, and assessment for planning. So that term, that keyword, systematic. Do we have a system in place when we set out to observe and assess in an authentic fashion our children and families? Having a system in place will ensure that we are being culturally responsive. Next slide. Some additional statements from NAEYC said we use methods of assessment that are responsive to children's current languages, individual experiences, and accomplishments. So, you know, the key part is being responsive, our assessments responsive. But another highlight of that sentence is current languages, being responsive. And a lot of what these sessions have been about has been multilingual, working with multilingual children, and how do we address that in different fashions. So even with assessment, how are we looking at those different languages? Use tools that are valid and reliable for the purpose and population in which it's intended. And this is, I've been out of the preschool classroom for a long time, but even as a college student, when I was studying child development, taking classes, I remember my nephew coming home from kindergarten and had bringing his work home, and he had to look at those worksheets, and it had snow and sleds and coat and just different things that he just could not connect with because of where we are from, where we lived, and what our experiences were. So I always remembered that experience with his learning as I think about assessments that are valid and reliable for the purpose and population in which they are intended. And then discussion, decisions having a major impact on children. Are we consulting with families related to those decisions? And then the last one is providing appropriate follow-up, making sure that children who may be in need of referrals or additional support is getting that follow-up as an outcome of our assessment and our observations. So this is a little bit from NAEYC and what their approach is to observing, documenting, and assessing. We can go to the next slide. So the cycles of observation. So this should look familiar also. How we implement, we observe, document what we observe. We try to analyze or interpret that information to feed into our planning and reflection, and that cycle just continues, right? So this is not as new or unfamiliar for those of us in the field. We tend to teach from, as faculty, observe and reflect and plan approach. But what we want to do is go a little bit deeper and see how we making better connections, especially in the reflection part, with what we are seeing, and how we reflecting a little bit more deeper on the children and what they are showing us through their experiences. So go to the next slide. So with that, we want to think about authentic assessment. Authentic assessment is the process of learning about a child's capabilities, including where they are and where they are going. seeing the individual child, really seeing the child. And when we see the child, we're not just looking at deficits. We're not just checking off the list of yes or no, or you saw this on this date or that date, but we're getting to know their abilities, their strengths, and their possibilities. So again, not deficit driven. During the pandemic, as a faculty, I was working with students, we transitioned to online format, and it really set the stage, for me to pay attention to assumptions that I easily made while teaching in person prior to the pandemic, and also inequities. And that's something that I've carried over even as we've, transitioned back to campus and teaching in different ways again, but really paying attention to the assumptions that I made when assessing my students. Oh, why didn't they just read the information I gave them? Or the rubric was available if they just followed the rubric, just these different things that I would just think of and say. But during that time and being on Zoom and communicating, engaging with students in a different way, I was able to pay closer attention to them, to who they were. We talked a lot more. They never would come to my office hours on campus, but they stayed on late after Zoom, to talk more. So getting to know them, how they processed the information that was being provided for them, their different languages and their comprehension. So really, I had an opportunity to really see my students differently. And I acknowledged that I had not been doing that before. So I really just like that statement of seeing the individual child, their abilities, their strengths, and their possibilities. Understanding the child's community, traditions, family, and backgrounds. It strengthens the assessment and helps to tell the child's whole inclusive story, because it's hard to really get to know a person if you only see them and acknowledge what you see in that one context. But really have an opportunity to see how this person evolves in different contexts, really give you more of an inclusive story about that person. And I like to share about my son, who had early experiences that were unique based on his background and his upbringing and different experiences he had, but his teachers only saw him from the class, what they saw in the classroom, and they would be amazed. They would, I use the word amazed, but I know they were thinking like, oh my gosh, she just thinks she knows everything, this child development person. And they didn't believe me. They didn't believe what I told them about my child that I know, of course. And so it was so much that they didn't believe, because they didn't see him outside of the context of school. So my son invited them to the YMCA to come see him play basketball. And when the teacher came, she was just like, that's a totally different child. I can't believe that's the same child. And I'm sitting there like, yeah, try to tell you, but who am I? I'm just the parent, right? I didn't feel that my input was valued, or that they were willing to see my child from a different perspective, in a different context. And that's something that I really, pay attention to, is when working with my adult learners and talking about how we address children and how we include their families. And then the last statement here is authentic assessment strategies are strength-based. So when we're thinking about authentic assessment, we're thinking about strength-based strategies. And we're going to look more at different strategies that are strength-based. Next slide. This is authentic assessment cycle. So it's the same, but a little bit different from the previous observationist cycle that we saw. So with here, it's let you know just from following the cycle that assessment is more than school readiness. We're observing to see children, who they are, their culture. So when you see observation, it says learning to see. We're looking at what makes them smile, what catches their attention, when they come into the room, who they look at, where do they tend to go. With documenting, we're doing more than the skills needed for assessment, but we're capturing their thinking and how they think about their thinking. So we're capturing those aha moments, what comes up for them. Reflection, so presentation and reflection, so that's key. What do we see when we observe? What story do we tell when we observe? Do we capture the child's authentic story, or do we capture our version of their story? How do we pack? So we're unpacking when we're reflecting, but the next stage, the next steps is now packing it all in order to plan. And so how do we pack in being culturally responsive? How do we pack in the dimensions of the children's language? How do we pack in everything from an anti-racist lens, developmentally appropriate, family inclusive, trauma informed? That seems like a lot, but that's all encompassing of what authentic assessment is. And believe it or not, that's all encompassing of what school readiness is. So this is the authentic assessment cycle, and we're going to be looking at some authentic assessment strategies, starting with translanguaging with Jolene.
Okay, hi everyone. So we're going to talk a little bit about translanguaging. We've been looking at children and considering multilingual learners. And this term translanguaging is something that has come up if you work with bilingual children or multilingual children. And I really love the power that translanguaging gives us. So here it says the definition is preschool children have a remarkable ability to embrace and express the dimensions of different languages beyond their socially and politically defined boundaries. This is called translanguaging. So translanguaging, it's a term used to describe practices that allow and encourage multilingual learners to use their full linguistic repertoire in order to empower them and to help them realize their full potential. So it means encouraging them to speak, to write, or translate from their first language or any of the languages that they speak, as well as English to support their learning. Sorry, I hit mute when I wanted to hit the next slide, I hit mute. Okay, so this is translanguaging in action. So what this is there's an article, and we have resources at the end, so you'll be able to see all the resources on this, but there's an article written about translanguaging in early childhood education in Luxembourg, from practice to pedagogy, and this is taken out of this research that they did, and they were trying to, they taught teachers how to infuse translanguaging as pedagogy in an early childhood classroom. And so this table illustrates Miss Clara, who's a teacher, and Felice, a 3-year-old child, translanguaging while looking at a book during free play. So if you look at the little chart on the right here, you're going to see the actor, so Felice and Miss Clara, the description, like if they're pointing, so the gestures are important here, any kind of language utterances. So again, there are 3 languages. This is in Luxembourg, so Luxembourgish, I guess is how you say it, and is the national language where the school was. The child also spoke Portuguese and English, and then the translation. So if you want to know what it was that they're saying, it's the last column is the translation. So this illustrates how adults and children weave together a multimodal and multilingual resources to communicate, negotiate meaning, and ensure comprehension. And again, on the right, you're going to see the actions, pointing gestures, movements, and those 3 languages. So moving easily between Luxembourgish, Portuguese, and English, and using the whole body enabled the teacher, Miss Clara, and Felice to co-construct meaning. And so I love this. So translanguaging, if anybody knows me, I'm very much about ratio-inspired practices, and I love co-construction as in pedagogy. I think it's really important. And so this is a tool that infuses co-construction into the early childhood classroom. The three-year-old boy, he pointed to details in the picture and labeled the animals in Portuguese. You'll see that in line 1 and line 5. And he used English in line 3. And he also used Luxembourgish with some Portuguese mixed in line 7 and 11. And he did all that to make himself understood. So that's his communicative practices, right? To guarantee comprehension, he pointed and imitated the slithering movement of a snake. The teacher listened to Felice and confirmed in lines 2 and 4. And she used the correct term in line 6 when he confused snake with worms, when he said the word, when he mixed up those two words. To help Felice remember the names of animals and the word heart, she pointed to the objects in the book and she drew a heart on his chest to make him feel the shape. I love that. And that's in line 12. She also repeated words in line 4, 6, and 8. She translated some of the words. And as Felice did not know the word ladybird, she offered him the word in Luxembourgish, in Portuguese. Felice not only had an opportunity to acquire the Luxembourgish names of the animals he knew in Portuguese, but he may also have learned more about a grasshopper, a snake, and a ladybird. Miss Clara showed him the grasshopper he had not mentioned in the story and provided some explanations in line 2. She also rephrased his short utterances and embedded them in slightly larger chunks. So she would rephrase them in a larger sentence. And that was to promote language learning. So this is an example of translanguaging embedded into an early childhood classroom, and how the teacher used let him access his full repertoire of language in order for them to read this book together. So there's a great video, and I linked it in the resources, by Ofelia Garcia. She's wonderful, and she talks a lot about translanguaging. There's a lot of articles that have been written by her as well. And she says all bilingual communities translanguage. It's the norm in a bilingual community. And translanguaging lets children use all the tools at their disposal to highlight what they know and can do, something that's not possible when languages are viewed in hermetically sealed units. And one thing we said earlier in these workshops, so this is the 6th workshop, and earlier in the workshops, we did talk a lot about sometimes people think that bilingual children, it's almost like they have language in 2 separate parts of their brain, or 2 suitcases in their brain, and they'll take, some of English out of one side of the brain and some of Spanish out of another part of their brain. And that's not true. Language is not in these separate units. Ofelia Garcia talks a lot about that bilingual children use an entire language repertoire, all their languages, to communicate and make meaning. They use a whole system unique to themselves. What she said about herself is, she said, it's not that English and Spanish do not exist. It's that I have one language repertoire from which I select features that are appropriate to communicate. So again, children have one language repertoire from which they select features that are appropriate to communicate. It kind of reminds me of code switching as well. When you talk with your friends, you talk in a certain way, and you have a large repertoire. I have a large repertoire of language that I don't use when I'm presenting. Like there might be some words that I wouldn't use that maybe with my friends I would be using. You select different words from our repertoire. So she's saying it's the same thing with multilingual children. Language is all together, and they're pulling from that repertoire, from that one package, that one system, and choosing the different words to use. Now, in the very top, there's a line that says, my mama drives a cafe car. That's a 5-year-old boy. And I put that in there. It's something that I remembered when I first moved to Los Angeles. I worked in a kindergarten classroom, And a lot of the children were bilingual. And at that time, I thought I wanted to, this was when we had bilingual education. Then they got rid of bilingual education in LA Unified. I'm not sure if you guys remember that. So this was right before they had bilingual modified classes, and then they got rid of those. But this little boy had said, my mama drives a cafe car, and the teacher was like, your mom drives a coffee car? And she kind of laughed. And I remember thinking, well, no, he's saying brown, because I knew that word meant brown. And so for him, he was accessing his full repertoire. And the thing that was interesting, if you speak Spanish, if you look at this is the syntax that he used is English. This is an English syntax. So the brown car is how you'd say it in English. But if he was to say the sentence in Spanish at home with his family, he might say, carro café or auto café. So it would be different, right? But so he wasn't sure of the word brown, or maybe at home they call the car café. So he used that word that he knew. And so he's not wrong. And that's what I think happens a lot, is that when we are assessing children, a lot of times the assessments that you see happening, like dual language assessments, a lot of times they evaluate each language separately. And so these assessments often treat language of bilinguals as a set of discrete skills that function independently. So languages are assessed and scored separately, and those scores are going to be interpreted separately as well. And so translanguaging eliminates that and looks at, okay, look, he knew this vocabulary word. He went into his full repertoire of skills and was able to pull out this word, and he put it in this sentence, and he used it in this sentence appropriately, right? So we want to encourage translanguaging, and it really involves fostering positive attitudes towards multilingualism and encouraging multilingual learners to be proud of all their language skills and allowing them to choose which languages to use at any time. And that's a key feature of translanguaging. So the power is in the child. I love this. So language hierarchies exist in the classroom and in assessment practices. So many educators see language in a hierarchy. English is viewed as the most important language. So as language number one, L1, it's dominant. The child's other languages are looked at as the second or third important language. So for Felice, in the first example, the dominant language would have been Luxembourgish, and then L2 and L3 would have been Portuguese and English in that situation. But this view means that the power is in the language and not in the speaker. But translanguaging, it shifts that perspective for us. The power is in the speaker and in their full repertoire of language. And that's where we really need to make that shift and think about that when we are thinking about assessing children. So why translanguaging? So if translanguaging is not considered, an injustice occurs for multilingual children. When teaching English only, educators ignore a large part of the child's language and the full spectrum of their language skills. If the assessment tool only considers English, again, this assesses less than half of their language repertoire, their language skills, and their abilities. So a bias occurs here, right? Multilingual children who do not do as well, they won't do as well as their monolingual peers on English only assessments. Monolingual children are being assessed with their entire repertoire of language, not a portion like bilingual or multilingual children. And that's something that we want to be careful of, that we want to caution against. And so authentic assessment with multilingual learners means validating the internal perspective of the speaker. Does anybody want to make any comments before I go on? Because I said a lot, and then LaShawn will start the next part.
Gloria.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, I would like to make a comment that that Jolene, your point is very interesting and so true, that because like we know people, all the children that come from different countries and they have different languages. Sometimes we just not judge, right? But we assume like teachers, like probably, I mean, doesn't mean that they don't know, because like they know like the shapes, in their own language, but sometimes it's hard for them to express it in English. And sometimes when we do the evaluation, the assessment for the ELD, when we do the ELD and then we do the regular evaluation,
Yeah.
the LLD, then we make a difference. You say, oh, he knows the shape, he knows this is probably he knows, but of the first 6 up a really assessment, because we really doesn't know the child that much. So that's a really, really interesting point that you just made up, and I really appreciate that you like kind of open my mind to now, to think more, to think deeply when we're evaluating the child, because sometimes the child from their country, he already have knowledge, but we assume like you say, because we just thinking probably in English, like, oh, because the number one is English, then we just think more on that item. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Gloria. And yeah, I mean, tonight we can't get, it's not a whole lecture on translanguaging, but I think it's so important. We're going to talk more. We're going to continue on this, but I am fascinated by it. It really connects, and I'll talk a little bit more about this with I think the Reggio perspective a lot as well. But I hope that if you are working with children and you are interested in this, really look at the work from Ophelia Garcia and some of the work that's out there on translanguaging. It's really informative, and I think it's something that we just need to talk more about with our students as well. Okay, LaShawn?
Thank you, Jolene. Yeah, I was going to ask if anyone, had any takeaways or anything they wanted to share so far. Feel free to post it in the chat if you like, or you can raise your hand or unmute. But we want to, just continue the conversation about culturally responsive observation and assessment. And, being a early childhood educator, preschool teacher, working for Head Start, and I resonated with what Gloria was sharing. As an education specialist, when I would visit my teachers and support them with how they were assessing children and things like that. And that was the main thing that would come up. Children who were being assessed by English only speaking teachers assess those kids differently if English was not their native home language. So that was something that we had to address as in Head Start with all of our educators, because that was an issue. It's also something that I've acknowledged myself as an adult, working with adult learners. I learned so much from my students when they are assessed in different formats, not just tests, and not only in writing either. So working on Zoom and using different resources allowed me to assess my students differently, using Flipgrid and other, video, when they didn't even have to show their faces or their background, but just to hear their voice and hear them talk about what they were experiencing and how they understood the work. So it goes at all levels, but definitely with our children, our youngest of children. So I see some posts in the chat. I appreciate that the bias is mentioned, because I have seen that often where teachers think the child doesn't know something and fail to consider their language diversity. Very good point. And thank you, Gloria, for your valuable and powerful comment. Assessment should be provided to our children in their home language by an educator that speaks their home language. That part is frequently missed. Thank you. So as we're looking at culturally responsive observation and assessment, just recapping, we looked at NACCE's observation practices, focusing on some of those terms, being reflective, receiving family input, systematic, being responsive, and reliable and valid for the population that we are serving. And then also consulting with families when it's, you know, making impact or making decisions for the children, and making sure we're providing adequate follow-up. And then there's the authentic assessment, where we are looking to see who that child really is. And that includes their language, that includes their home life and their family background. And so much of what Jolene just shared with us is even more valuable, that concept of translanguaging and understanding how the child is communicating in different ways, different dimensions that are all valuable to how we assess the child. So exploring all dimensions of a child's language, removing the language hierarchies, and shifting the power to the child's voice, really focusing on who they are, what they have to say. So using those authentic strategies, and we're going to talk about other authentic assessment strategies, but using authentic assessment strategies helps us learn about the children. We build on what we learn. So as we observe and we document, we just continue to build on what we are learning about the children, and provide opportunities to better understand children and their family. So what assessments are we using that incorporates the family's input and helps us to connect better with the family values and cultural traditions? Another thing we have to do is address inequities. So last session, we shared a lot, well, our audience shared a lot about resources and how to connect that homeschool, to keep that homeschool connection going. And a lot of resources were shared, many technology driven. And so just understanding the inequities, we have a lot of advances and things that we can do differently when it comes to assessment, but we want to make sure that we're also addressing what the families can access and their role of providing input. I had a co-teacher who also works at Harper College in the Child Development Center, and she shared how one of the families of parents was not connecting with the school, not communicating with the teachers, not really getting involved. And the teachers were kind of, you know, making assumptions or whatever about that family. And what it all boiled down to is that the system that they were using, I forget what it's called, it might be Genie, but one of the technology resources they were using to share and communicate back and forth with parents, that parent did not know that she could change it to her language. So she was not engaged because she was not, they were not engaging with her in the language that she communicated in. And once that was done, they heard a lot from the family and received a lot of input from the family. Someone is asking, what is Learning Genie? And I think that is what the name of it is. So if someone could explain that in the chat, go ahead and respond for Reka. But from my understanding, it is a tool that's used to share, to communicate with families, share information about their children, post images and things like that to keep the parents engaged and connected with what's happening with their children in the classroom environment. And then the last one, make thinking and learning visible in a culturally and linguistically appropriate way. So this is all culturally responsive observation and assessment. So going beyond just the basic observation cycle and really paying attention to being authentic, to seeing the child, their language, and understanding the power of the child's language as we assess them. And I'm just going to show a really quick video. Okay. Jolene.
Yeah, I'm trying to, oh.
I need to restart with the audio.
Will be the switch.
Reshare the screen, or I can do it.
Hold on. The audio is not coming up.
Those two little boxes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me go back here. Share some.
Oh, thank you for sharing, Reka, in the chat. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Youngju, you are perfect.
Youngju.
But I know it won't always feel like that. Your name will make you feel different. Like they don't want to get to know you. But I promise, there will be those who try.
Hey, Youngju.
The MVP award goes to Yeyoung-jo.
It's actually Youngju.
Youngju.
You remember what Youngju means? It means strong and resilient. Because I know you will be.
What a beautiful name. Can you teach me how to say it?
So I just want to show that quick video because I love the message that belonging starts with the name. It's belonging, it's the name, it's the language, it's the child, and it's really seeing the child and who he or she is. So I'm going to turn it over to Jolene. We talk about languages.
Okay, you can see that? Okay, great. So as I said, when I was talking a bit about translanguaging, and then as LaShawn's been talking about that, a cycle of assessment, that observation cycle, you know, that documentation and making learning visible, I'd love to bring it back to the Reggio approach and the 100 languages of children, because the 100 languages of children, the main focus of the 100 languages, I mean, it's a key principle of Reggio inspired practices, the Reggio inspired approach that you may know of. And it refers to communication and emphasizes the importance of providing children with 100 ways to share their thinking of the world around them. So the 100 languages, it also represents the infinite amount of potential that each child naturally has. So in going back to the professional development where Miss Clara and Felice are working together, and they were co-constructing and they were making meaning, you know, meaning making and communication happens through 100 languages. Construction happens through 100 languages, and co-construction happens through 100 languages with children. So this can be words, it can be gestures, it can be clay, paint, sculpture, wire, dancing, block building, dramatic play. The 100 languages of children can be expressive, communicative, symbolic, metaphorical, logical, imaginative, relational. And so it's our job to be good listeners and reflective practitioners. So we really need to listen. The language is there, you guys. So when we're going to look and assess, we just need to think about assessing differently. And when we want to look at that observation cycle, we want to observe with our ears and with our eyes, and not just the tool that's in front of us, because the children are, when they're working with wire or they're working with paint, they are communicating something to us. They're communicating ideas. It's not just their verbal language. In many school systems today, the emphasis on standards, goals, and predefined outcomes has resulted in an unintended narrowing of our views about learning. As a result, a de-emphasis or no emphasis is placed on the thinking of the child in relation to the curriculum, much less the thinking of the child that may appear unrelated to the curriculum goals driving the instruction. So do we stop and pause and think about what children are thinking about? And, you know, even if it's not maybe the curriculum goals, is today we're on a theme and we're talking about, I don't know, boats or something, and they're talking about something completely different. Or we have these certain things that we have to hit, these little standards, these boxes that we have to hit, and the child is doing something different. we have to really be flexible. I think language is flexible, and the 100 languages of children require us and ask us to be flexible for the child. When looking at documentation, so when LaShawn was talking about that assessment cycle and authentic assessment, we really want to look at documentation. So documentation is seen as visible listening, as the construction of traces through notes, slides, videos, also photos, work samples that you see here. I love this picture that the child is looking and he's reflecting on what is happening there. So he's looking back probably at himself or at his classmates intently. It's right there for him to reflect. So he can reflect on it, the teachers can reflect on it. So the construction of these traces, they not only testify to the children's learning paths and processes, but also make them possible because they're visible. For us, this means making visible and thus possible the relationships that are the building blocks of knowledge. So when Rinaldi is talking here, so her definition, she explains that traces are that visible evidence that focus on how children learn, as well as what they learn. She also emphasizes that when documentation makes learning visible, it makes reflection possible. And we know that we learn by reflecting. And I want to share a story in this next slide. And again, I'm saying what do the walls tell you, because if you go into Reggio, schools in Reggio Emilia, if you've gone there, or if you go into Reggio inspired schools, you see a lot of documentation around the room. And these are the traces, those visible traces of learning that's put up all around the different classrooms. And one time I saw Lillian Katz speak, and this was many years ago. She was at the time, I think she was the president of NAAC at the time, and she had an activity for us that I thought was really neat and I wanted to share with everyone. And that is that we were at Evergreen Community School in Santa Monica, and when we were there weren't any children in the classrooms, but we were given a name of a child, and we went around the room with no children present, and we went around and gathered the information that we could about the child that we were assigned to. So if you were assigned to Mary, you went around the room and you gathered from the walls, from the information in the classroom, whatever you could learn about this child. And it was remarkable. The traces of this child, the essence of the child, was everywhere in that classroom. And so this is an activity I think that would be great to do for those of you that work in early care and education. If you're in a school, look at the roster of your children, and when the kids aren't there, go around the room and write down what you see in your environment that tells you more about each child. Where do they play? What are their interests? What are their favorites? What words do they use? What gestures do they make? How do they make meaning in the classroom? How and where is their home language represented? And how and where is their home culture represented? So this means that you would be a practitioner that does this kind of gathering and collecting. So I think most schools now have teachers do authentic assessment, and that they are gathering little documentation bits maybe for a portfolio, but I'm not sure if everyone puts stuff around the room or if they have stuff around the room. But this is encouraging you to think about that. If somebody walks into the classroom, what do they learn about the children? And I really think this is the missing piece when we're talking about play-based education. I think that if you're doing a lot of process work in your classroom or in your school with children, and you are sending home process work, but you're not sharing the whole story, the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, the how with the parents, it's hard for them to unpack or to see the learning that's occurring. So you are a trained observer of children, and you know that this is cognitive development, physical, social, emotional development. You can see that, but do we share that with the parents? Is there evidence of that? So being better at sharing those bits with the parents and letting them see that by putting it in our classroom, you could have them in books or portfolios or family books, and also traces around the classroom. The children love to actually go and look at all of the items as well around the classroom. So I think it's really powerful to do that. We're going to, I'm trying to think, is that the next slide? Not yet, not yes. So we're going to talk a little bit, well, let me go back for a second on that slide. Do we have a second? I don't know what our time is like, LaShawn.
Couple of more minutes.
Just a couple minutes. Does anybody, who does documentation in their classroom? Is there anybody that wants to share? How do you do documentation? Does anybody take any photos or notes and post it around the room for the children? I mean, I like looking like this one. Does anybody do anything like this? Want to share what they do? No? Okay. So this, go ahead.
I'm not in a classroom anymore, but one thing that I used to do that I loved was creating portfolios with the children. And so their stories would go into their books, they called them, and they could pull their books out whenever they wanted and, you know, look over the stories that were there and add things if they wanted to. And so it was just a really fun way to get to know them, but also to give them access to the stories of, you know, their own and of their friends.
Great, I love that. It's usually their favorite book, the books that they create it with in the class or with their friends or with their family books and stuff like that. Children love books. So I think it's wonderful to create those books and put them in the book reading center. At Evergreen Community School, they had a shelf and it had the last name of each child, and you could pull up the book and then go through and look at it. And it had, you know, the child, their favorites and all about their family in there. There's identity panels in the classrooms. There's a lot of work in progress. So they would take photos of the children block building, similar to this photo here where you see them drawing. There's their words are captured, their photos are captured in this documentation, and then they put that up. A lot of schools will put it in the hallways. You'll see it in some of the schools in their hallways as well. And I like this where the teachers are looking at. Heather, go ahead. Hi, Heather.
Hello. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I did something similar. It was called Tell Me Your Story when I was working in a classroom. And around the classroom, as well as outside, we just had clipboards with blank paper. And the kids got to a point where they would come up to us and say, like, I want to tell you my story. And so we would literally just write word for word whatever they said to us, and then collect these over time and also create a book or a journal of some sort. And they could add pictures or whatever it was they wanted. But basically, we were giving meaning to their words and to, you know, their ideas and thoughts, and just valuing that they had something to say. And so that was always fun. And the kids really seemed to enjoy that.
I love it. That's great. Thanks. And that leads into our next thing that we're going to do. You guys talking about stories. We're going to talk about learning stories. But the last thing I want to say before we go into learning stories is assessment should be viewed as a social construction of knowledge. So that's what both of you guys were talking about. When you're talking about these stories, this is a social construction of knowledge through the study of children's learning made visible. And we are going to talk about learning stories. So we're going to we're going to do some group work on learning stories. But first, LaShawn's going to introduce this authentic assessment strategy called learning stories.
So yeah, so far we have some, you know, good ideas that you shared, but one authentic assessment is learning stories, where we're basically observing to see the child and we're telling the story based on what we saw. So it shares a story with the child, their family, and with guests, our educators, so other teachers or other people in the classroom that surround the child. Learning stories come from the tradition of oral storytelling to convey the importance of ordinary events in our daily lives. A learning story typically starts with the child's initiative and the educator observing the child's engagement. Learning stories are always positive and supportive. The story progresses through stages of engagement, becoming involved, intentionality, causing something to happen, and further developments if they occur. So we're going to walk through the process of a learning story. Jolene is going to get us started with Josie's strip.
Okay, so I need to share a different screen here, you guys. So there's a great, you guys can see this, there's a great, an early childhood educator and from Seattle that I stumbled upon, I don't know, quite a few years ago, named Tom Drummond. And Tom Drummond has a whole website. And again, we'll have that's in our resources. You can also look him up. And he has a lot on learning stories. And learning stories come from New Zealand. It's guided by the goals and strands of the Te Wariki people in New Zealand. And so they were really looking at Margaret Carr and Wendy Lee were looking at, these are children that in a culture that really honored and valued oral storytelling. And so learning stories are a way, they're an authentic assessment tool. And this one, Josie's Drip, so this is from Tom Drummond's site. And so how this goes, and we're going to go through the steps of a learning story for you. So part one, when you first go through the learning story, part one, the educator, part one is what did you see? So the educator describes without judgment what the child does and says. The educator approaches this as someone who cares and is listening and observing closely. This is like an anecdotal record. And it always starts with I, because you're giving the voice of the storyteller. So it starts with I. So the voices change in a learning story. Part one, it starts with an I. Part two, it's we. Part two is you. And then part three is we. So we're going to go through that. But this first part is I. And one thing is it's positive. You don't want to say anything negative about a child. And it's not also giving a judgment, like saying like, you're good. It just is very, you'll see. So we go. So Josie drips down a hill. So this is the first part. Josie had been painting a while when I saw her make a hill by pushing the paper toward the paint tray. I had never seen anyone do this before, so I began to take pictures. So they're using the I. Josie was closely watching the paint. Josie touched the brush to the painting at the top of the hill. A drip slowly ran down the hill, making a blue line. Josie filled her brush again and added more blue paint at the top of the slope in the very same place. Then she added paint to the pink area on top of the hill. The second drop of paint began to slide downhill through the pink area. The first drip line was now all the way at the bottom. Josie pushed the paper toward the paint tray and made the hill steeper. The drip was going almost straight down now. She added more paint to the top. Josie watched intently as the drip slowly made its way to the bottom of the hill. Okay, so the first part where I went through all of that, do you notice that I wasn't saying like, she's so good or she's so great? I wasn't saying anything, nothing negative and nothing positive. It was just basically like an anecdotal record, just saying what I saw, right? Okay, that's part one. And then part two, LaShawn's gonna do part two.
So part two is what does it mean? So in part two, you're talking to the child. So you're using the word you. So this will be talking directly to Josie. You describe the significance of what you saw. What learning do you see happening? You want to use the terms that explain development, learning, milestones, and or theoretical perspectives. And this is beneficial for parents to read and understand meaning behind the child's experience. So here's an example of how you write up what it means. Josie, you discovered how to make paint draw a line by sliding down a hill. You concentrated on how it moved. Not only were you a painter, today you are a scientist. You did an experiment. You watched the effect of the hill on the drip that you caused. The careful looking is how scientists discover how things work. You wondered about something and you figured it out. So that's part 2, when you're telling what it means and you're speaking directly to the child. So directly to Josie.
Okay, now part 3, you're looking at opportunities and possibilities. This is where we're going to reflect. So this is where the teachers meet together. You guys talk about, you know, when you're talking about that assessment cycle, right? We did the observation, we've gathered the documentation. Now we've looked at this documentation together and we're reflecting on the documentation. Like, what does it mean? And also what opportunities and possibilities, kind of like what's next, right? So this one we start with we, because again, these are the adults in the life of the child, and we're looking at how we can further support inquiry, investigation, exploration, and Josie's interests. So opportunities and possibilities. So this is the we part. Josie seems to have a disposition to wonder and be intrigued with the physical properties of paint that is worth exploring in great detail. We can bring out the easels tomorrow with thick paint and water that she can mix. Eyedroppers may help too. We will want to show these drip lines to the other children, or it may spark their interest too. Then a group of children might have some ideas of what to try next. And I love this because they're also going to then invite the other children into this, you know, into Josie's work. They're going to show those drip lines that they probably wouldn't have noticed that. They might not have noticed their classmate doing that, and they might not have noticed those drip lines. So they're going to show the other kids that, and they're probably, some of the other kids might want to paint and further explore as well, along with Josie. So the last part is they give a blank piece of paper. They make 2 copies of this, and they have a blank sheet, and they send it home with the family, and then the family reads the story and they get to write back. Do you want to read this one, LaShawn?
Sure. So now you're getting the parents' input. So Josie, you are amazing. I see you do this kind of close looking many times. There's a little part covered up here. Now you can see yourself doing it too. It was a joy to read this story to Josie. We read it over again and again. I never would have paid any attention to those horizontal lines at the bottom of her painting without seeing the pictures of her absolute concentration in making them. Thank you, teachers, for stopping to look at this precious person we love.
Okay, so we are going to, now we're gonna do one of these together. So this is just kind of the recap of what we read to you. We have a Google Doc, so you'll get all this from a Google Doc as well. So you don't have to copy it down, but we're going to actually, LaShawn, because I just reshared, let me go back out. Hold on, I'm gonna go back out and share again because so I can get that video to go. Oh, it's marked. So we're going to do this together, you guys. We want to practice this together as a group. We're going to look at this video, and we're just going to watch a couple minutes of it. And then we're going to ask you guys to help us to create, what would we say for part 1, part 2, part 3 of this learning story. So here we go. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it. gonna focus on Samantha, everyone.
Guys, we got about 2 more minutes here. 2 more minutes. Finish over there, Candace.
Okay. So we just wanted to do this with a quick little observation. Then we're going to actually have another video for you guys to do it together in a breakout. Would someone like to start and just do part 1 for us? What did you see, and try it out in that I voice? And so this is, again, this is an anecdotal record. Anybody want to try it?
Was it Samantha with the phone blocks and Sarah with the wooden blocks?
I think it's Samantha with the wooden blocks.
Wooden blocks, okay.
Samantha had the wooden blocks. I mean, we could do either, but I thought it was probably better to focus on one, right? Does anybody want to?
With part 1, remember you're just telling what did you see?
I can try. I'm not sure if I'll do it correctly, but I'll try.
Thank you.
So I'm stating what I see her do, right?
Right. Yeah, Samantha,
So-
the one with the what you could do either one actually, whichever one you focused on.
I was focusing on Samantha. So I see Samantha stacking blocks one on top of the other. I'm not sure, like, yeah. I wasn't quite sure 100% like how to word what I'm seeing. And I mean, if I'm doing it like an anecdotal note, then I'm just obviously stating what I see. So stacking blocks one on top of the other. She moves across the room to gather more blocks and brings them back, continuing to stack. The blocks are, I don't know how high, but counting however many high. And then do you indicate like her interaction at the end with the other child, or I don't know how far you go?
You could.
Yeah, you could.
Okay. So well, she didn't really have an interaction with her, I guess. The other child was more telling her like that could fall over, and she didn't really acknowledge her, but walked by seems to get more blocks, is what I assume.
Yes.
So is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yes, good. That's good. That's good. You're just telling what you see happening. That's Samantha's story. And so if the video, we watch the whole video, of course there would be more. It's 6 minutes before it'd probably be chapters, but it's you know, it's basically doing exactly what you just did, Heather. So thank you for sharing that. So the next part would be, what does it mean? So does anyone want to take a stab at the what does it mean? Now this is the you language. So now you're talking directly to Samantha. So based on what Heather shared, or even what you observed, what does it mean?
So you would start off and say, Samantha, you were building like an architect. You could say something like that. I'm just going to give a prompt, and then somebody want to take it from there?
Is this the part where you start analyzing it a little bit?
Yes. So this is part 2. So part 2, in a voice, I'll read it again. In a voice to the child, describe the significance of what you saw. Parents will read this, therefore you can use terms to explain development, learning, milestones, and or any theoretical perspective. So this is the part where you're using your trained eye as an early childhood educator. You're going to make that learning visible. You're speaking to the child. You're saying Samantha, and maybe she doesn't understand, cognitive development or hand-eye coordination or something like that, but it doesn't matter. You still can use those terms, but you are saying Samantha. You're starting off telling to her what it means. Samantha. You want to try it, Rika?
I'm going to give it a try. I've been out of the classroom for so long. Samantha, you look like an architect building a long and tall tower of a beautiful building. I see you being very careful in picking up the blocks and balancing while stacking them on top of each other. You went back and forth trying to see if you can continue to build more and more higher than yourself. I don't know, what else did she do?
That's great.
Yeah, I was jotting down, I had some of the similar, the balancing, I had stacking same sizes, so recognizing the sizes and was moving pretty quickly. So those are some of the things that I had noted.
Yeah,
Good.
I noticed how confident she was in her movements. She'd go grab the block, but then she'd slow down her fast movement, so she would set it very carefully using that hand-eye coordination. I also saw her switching her hands. She was grabbing with her left hand and then moving it to her right hand and slowly putting it with her right hand.
Yeah, and she has a very good control over her hand movement, like the way she was placing the blocks on it. Like she was not shivering or shaking or moving it in any other direction. So yeah, I had the same thoughts. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for trying it too. And I would say, to her, Samantha, you're a skilled builder. You built as high as yourself, because she built look how tall she built. Okay, so let's move on to part 3. So part 3 is the reflection part where the teachers get together and they're like, okay, now we're also thinking about what can we do next with this? So even looking around that center, that block center, is there anything you would add to that block center? So we have got a bunch of educators in here. You guys all have ideas of what could be added to that block center, maybe based on what we saw. So it's opportunities and possibilities. This is going to be the we. So this is where the adults reflect upon the child and how we can support further inquiry, investigation, exploration, and Samantha's interest. So who wants to try the we? We could what? What could we do?
We could add images of skyscrapers, of tall buildings, different, or even, shorter buildings, different types of buildings. You could even add, I don't know what's in those buckets, but maybe like people or, actual objects to help enhance whatever block building she's doing, animals, cars, airplanes, I don't know. Maybe books about skyscrapers or, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking the same thing. Was anybody else thinking that? Like, wouldn't it be great to have some books there's a book that I see like welcome, but I don't know. I mean, there are some books kind of in the basket, but have you seen when teachers put the books out on top of the bookcase? So that might be a great place to put that, and also some photos of the skyscraper. What kind of measuring tools would you guys add in?
I
would
was about
recommend,
to,
oh, sorry.
sorry,
ahead.
no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I would recommend adding real blueprints with angles and rulers and measuring tapes and black markers and clipboards
I
to
love it.
start planning as if you were an architect. You would start just encourage emergent writing to go along with the block building.
Those are good. Ray,
Great.
Yeah, I was also about to add the similar thing, like giving them the writing tools now, adding those things. And also I was wondering if we can add different shapes and different sizes of blocks just to expand, and also maybe a stepping stool or something, so that we don't know whether she wants to go higher than that. And maybe she'll figure it out, how the balance and the foundation of that tower is going to hold up, and how high it can go further. So, bringing those extra tools or extra things would be helpful.
Okay, great. So you guys have the idea. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do, sorry, didn't mean to do that. We're going to do a breakout session, and we have a little video and we have a Google Doc, and we have a little video. Barb put the Google Doc in the, and this shows the learning story. So this is also great because you guys can keep it. It shows this process if you like the learning story, but we wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of practice in smaller groups, maybe groups of like 6 or 7. And you're gonna watch a little tiny short video. This is of a little boy, Tyler. He's 18 months, and he is building using Cloud Dough. So you're gonna watch him. It's super short, just a couple seconds. And then you can put your group number in the Google Doc, and we're gonna have you do the parts of the learning story. So you'll see that. You wanna do it in groups of 4, LaShawn, you think would be good?
Yes, I have it set up and ready to go.
Okay, LaShawn has it set and ready to go in groups of 4. And if you look in the chat, the Google Doc is there. So if you just select somebody to be the note taker to actually go in and fill out the Google Doc. You ready to go to the groups?
Yes. Any questions? We all set? Okay, here we go.
So welcome back, everyone. We know it went fast, and we had a few little glitches there we had to iron out. Is everybody back now, Barb?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks like it. Okay. So here's our Google Doc. What's really interesting to me, and I was looking at it a little bit, is, we all look at this teaches us, right? We can all look at the same thing and we see something different, a little bit different. So the part 1, you guys don't have to read your whole thing, but let's talk about the process a little bit. So this is a form of authentic assessment. We're creating a learning story. Children love to read the learning story. We talked about stories and the importance of stories and in the classroom. It's one of the favorite things they like to read. And you can gather these into a portfolio or into a book for the kids, for the children. Anything you wanted to comment on about the process? And I know it can be hard at first, and then you get better at it as you do it more.
I appreciate how simplified you made it. I mean, I've been looking and attending learning stories for a long time. Like Brenda, I'm no longer in the classroom with young children, but I am with adult learners, and we are practicing learning stories. But I really appreciate how you simplified this with the I, the you, and the we. It's something I can apply to my classes at Saddleback College, and I appreciate that.
I was telling LaShawn that, when I first did this, I had this big long worksheet that I created from somewhere. I don't even know where. And I brought it in with the students because LaShawn does learning stories too. We were talking about this, and I was like, and I kept paring it down and down. I mean, like, I wanted the essence and the importance, but the language, like I said, the I, the to the child, and like, that you, and then we just kept, but Tom Drummond does that. So Tom Drummond's website, he has really good learning stories on there. So I use those a lot in my classes. And then he's the one that shows that. That's where I got a lot of this from him. But I changed it a lot so that the students could do this in the classroom. We would do this with them. And LaShawn as well. So we talked about, it's easy to get tripped up on who you're talking to, right?
Yes. Well, I want to thank everyone for participating and attempting the process. And of course, not enough time to really, this will be a whole nother session on itself, like learning stories. But we just wanted to introduce you to or remind you of those authentic assessments, and how, especially with learning stories, when we talk about the many languages and dimensions of children's language, how they can be captured in an assessment process like this. And the important element that I like is the family's involvement in it as well. It's really good. So thank you again for participating. So we're gonna move a little, quicker through the next couple of slides to get us to our ending. So I want to show this video as he's continuing on about telling the story. So let's watch this video, and then we will come back and just reflect on what we observed.
Work. Come on. Can you hear the sound?
If you think you know what happens next, ask yourself why. These are the Black stories we've been shown. A narrow view that limits our understanding. But there's so much more to see. The full picture of Black life. Let's widen the screen so we can widen our view.
Thank you, Jolene. So just wanted to show that video. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but questions that would come up would be what may have came to mind when you were watching it, some of your thoughts and ideas. The whole concept is just widening your screen, widening your lens, and how you view situation, experiences, people, and their stories. So as we've talked about authentic assessment, we've talked about being culturally responsive. These are the things that we want to think about, and we can't, Jolene mentioned a little bit about the bias that comes up with language. So we have to consider this concept of implicit bias, just those unconscious beliefs and stereotypes that influence how we engage with others, our day-to-day interactions, but they also may influence the stories. They also may influence our perception and how we see the experiences that children are having. So it's important for us to reflect on our own actions, our thoughts, and our feelings We have to make time for that. So that reflection piece and that authentic assessment cycle, it has to include our own reflections and having conversations with each other about how things show up for us when we are observing and engaging with our children. It's important for us to do that because if our biases, implicit biases are not checked, they're left unchecked, they can also traumatize children that we work with. You know, we can be that risk factor for children because we're not recognizing. Going back to the earlier video with young June, when her name and the importance of being able to pronounce and acknowledge children by their name, well, in addition to their language and their culture and their family. Next slide. So there's been research and studies done and some also faculty resources made available through Early Ed U out of the University of Washington. And so this is something that comes from a module they have on implicit bias. And I use this with my adult learners, with my students at the college, when we look at the images and just tell what we see, what's going on here. What do you see that tells you that? So we don't have the time, but if you want, you can post in the chat. But something I just wanted to share was like when I do this with my college students and they know we're talking about implicit bias, it's interesting that this last class I had, they would not address the boy at all. They didn't talk about the boy at all. And so we joked about it afterwards, but then had a more intentional conversation about that. And one of my students was honest. She said, I was unsure. I didn't want to be biased and make the assumption that the boy was trying to take the doll away. So I said nothing. And so that opened that door for the class to have that conversation about the biases we may have about certain genders of certain races. And that becomes a part of our story. So how we see the little boy or all the children in these images, but specifically the little boy could be through a lens of the boy being regulated, where he's trying to help in the situation, or through the lens of the child being dysregulated, where we're assuming that he's trying to take away the doll. And of course, we need more than just still images to really explore this experience and get a more authentic story. But I just wanted to share this so that we can, bring to life that concept of implicit bias. And so I'm going to end with our, with our next slide, just reminding us that implicit bias can be addressed by accepting that you do have a bias. Everybody has biases. I introduced this conversation with my students just by talking about foods we like to eat, where we like to get those foods from, people we like to date, things like that. And we start the conversation off that way. And then we go do those deeper dives into the biases and where some of those perspectives and beliefs come from. So you can address it by questioning yourself. So what came up for you when you were watching that video? You didn't have to share it, but question yourself. Think about it for yourself. And reaching out to understand. We have to be more comfortable with that in safe places and spaces, hopefully with our colleagues, and then reflecting on your reactions and interactions. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments about that, feel free to post it in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and move us on. Yes, we need another 2 hours. Somebody post it.
We do.
Go ahead, Jolene.
So commitment to practice, we always want to end this as, just asking yourself, like, what one thing could you do differently? What one thing might you be able to take away from here that you want to try? What we've done in the past is we've done like a little waterfall. If you want to type something in the chat, is there one takeaway from this that you would maybe like to implement with your practices? Maybe you would like to explore a little further. If you want to put something in the chat, we'll give you just like a minute to type something in the chat, and then we're going to say go, and then we all hit go, and then we flood our chat with a waterfall of ideas of what moving forward, what we want to do, what's next, like our next steps kind of a thing. So go ahead and type something. in the chat. What do you think? Is there something from this that you want to explore further? Something you want to implement? Something you want to research? Something you want more information on? Or something you're going to commit to do? Give you like 30 more seconds.
Ready?
Ready.
Okay. Everybody, if you type something in, go ahead and press enter now.
Great.
Awesome. Translanguaging, yes. Good. Open mind, the students. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Advocate for translanguaging with young children. Good. Thank you. Awesome. So we're going to close out. We have a survey that is posted in the chat. So if you can please click on the link and complete the survey, and you will receive a copy of the PowerPoint. Well, Martine, how about you close us out? Thank you.
I come in as the guilty party at the end after everybody else has done so much hard work. But I do thank you, LaShawn and Jolene, for mentioning the post-workshop reflection. We prefer that to post-workshop survey. Our reflections are really important for ourselves and to share. So I appreciate everybody who took part in the waterfall activity and for your post-workshop reflections. We are working on a limited team this evening. 2 of our team members are sick, and I want to thank Barb particularly, who herself is not feeling too well today, for doing everything behind the scenes. I want to thank Jolene and LaShawn for a fabulous evening, and that's not just me, LaShawn. Jolene, if you look at the chat, you probably haven't had much of a chance to read it during the teaching session, but there are some wonderful comments there, and Barb will save that for us to review later. I'd like to thank everyone who participated this evening in a very full and engaged session. I'm sad to say that it's the last of our workshops, but we always end at Peach on a high note. So thank you, everyone who participated. We are hoping to continue the work with Dr. Seuss and keep you posted. If you'd like to stay in touch with us at Peach, please feel free to do so. But here's my big guilt moment. I'm going to say stay in touch with Barb Rosner, but Barb is always inundated. So any one of us facilitating tonight will gladly pass on your desires or requests to work with us at Peach. I wish everybody a very happy evening. The sessions will be have been recorded and will be shared. We're setting up a resource that everyone will have access to after these sessions are over. And as director of the project, I'll be submitting a final report at the end of June for our 18 months together of planning and facilitating. So it's with joy and much pride, good pride, that I say thank you to everyone on all the teams and all the participants. Thank you. Have a lovely evening.